Hi guys, welcome back to another video about meat in the Bible. And today we're going to take a specific look at the sacrifices. And I'm so excited. Editing Dara here. Just want to apologize for my crazy eyes in this entire video. You can tell I'm excited when I make really focused and intense eye contact. And it was so long and so much information, I'm not going to go back and refilm it. So enjoy. Before I give too many of my thoughts, I wanted to just quickly jump in and tell you what each of the sacrifices are, because obviously, you don't have this off the top of your head. Or if you do, I would love to talk to you. So please leave me a comment. If this is the kind of thing that you totally jive with, I want to know, and we can have an awesome conversation. Okay, let's get into it. With each sacrifice, the animal's blood is drained, and depending on which sacrifice it's for, different parts of the animal are burned on the altar or just cooked. Here's a breakdown of what each of the sacrifices were. Number 1, the burnt offering. The entire animal is placed on the altar of sacrifice, and all of it is burned. This is in representation of complete surrender to God and your whole life being consecrated to Him in holiness. The animal had to be a male without blemish, and originally the animal had to be a firstborn, and depending on the personal possessions of the individual, the animal that is sacrificed can be anything from a bullock, a ram, a he-goat, turtle doves, or young pigeons. Number 2, the grain offering. What was offered on the altar was unleavened bread, and it represented the work of your hands. It is something that mankind cultivated. This sacrifice is a representation of dedicated service to God. And this offering was usually coupled with the burnt offering or the peace offering. So it wasn't always offered by itself. Usually it was in conjunction with 2 other offerings. It was also given to the priest for their service and sustenance, so the priest could eat it if they wanted to. Number 3, the peace offering, or as I like to call it, the holy barbecue. This one was a gratitude offering and essentially a celebration of salvation. It was for those who wanted to have a more intimate connection with God, because the entire sacrifice was basically like having a holy communion and a feast with God. And the peace offering had a 3-fold purpose. 1, to thank God for all of their blessings. 2, it was a free will offering to voluntarily enter into a covenant with God. 3, it was a vow offering as a way to make a covenant with God. This one used a male animal without blemish, and it was cattle, sheep, or goats, but no fowl or any other substitutes were used for this one. And part of the reason was because this was something where portions of the animal would be burned on the altar, and then other portions would be up to the individual as well as the priests to eat. This is the only sacrifice where all 3 parties, God, the priests, and the individual, consumed the sacrifice together. And often people would gather their families together as well, because if you're eating a bullock, which is the size of a cow, that is a lot to consume. And there was also a time restriction. They could only consume the meat for 2 days of the sacrifice. And then on the 3rd day, whatever was left had to be burned on the altar. Why would that be? One theory that I really get behind is that it was intended for people to actually feast, to not worry so much about saving the meat for later. It was intended for you to eat as much as you could within those 2 days. I also don't think it's a coincidence that it's considered the peace offering, when so many times myself and other people have described that when you eat so much meat, there's a lot more peace that just comes into your life. You just feel this persistent calm that you wouldn't otherwise.
True state of calmness. Yes, the meat did that. I had this overall feeling of calmness and well-being. This kind of washed over me within, it had to be within 5 days of starting to eat this way. My anxiety levels just went so far down.
Because when you observe people going on low carb and fasting, there is a direct and immediate improvement in mood.
So to me, this specific offering seems like a tool that God used to allow people to be in a position to hear Him and feel His presence, because biologically their bodies were being nourished and satisfied. I think it also is worth noting that visceral fat, as well as the fat on the rump of the animal, is what was offered and burned to God. Why fat? I think that suggests that the fat was the choicest part of the animal, because you wouldn't give a sacrifice and burn something on the altar to God if it wasn't something that was precious to you. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a sacrifice. So I think this specific sacrifice tells us a little bit more about the role of meat to nourish you, the role of meat to give you energy, the role of meat in having your body being satisfied so that your spirit can focus on God. Now, I know with fasting, it's kind of the opposite. You deprive your body in order to be able to be more in tune with God. But it's cool to see that the reverse can also be true, that you can be so well nourished and so energized that focusing on God becomes easy and second nature. It also was to celebrate the fact that everybody was in right relationship with each other, that the priests, the individual and their family, and God were able to come together for a feast, which I think is what Jesus uses often in the New Testament when he talks about parables using feasts. It's pulled from the idea of this peace offering. Number 4, the sin offering. Now, this one is absolutely fascinating to me because the type of animal that you offered reflected your position and the intensity of the sin. Most commonly, the sin offering was done for groups of people. So it is theorized that this is much more for covering sin nature rather than particular nitty-gritty sins. This one is not consumed by fire. Whatever animal is offered, it is not burnt on the altar. Instead, it is used as a sacrificial meal for the priests. So essentially, the sin offering is consumed, wholly eaten, and it is used to nourish another individual, which I think that gives wonderful implications on how God views sin, because we're very quick to shame, partially because we want to correct a behavior and we want to be back in harmony with other people, but we go about it in a very forceful way. Whereas God sees sin, which in the Bible, the word sin means to miss the mark. It's not like you are a shameful being because you were full of sin. That's not how it's used in the Bible. It's like, oh, the same people, it's the same word that they use when somebody is learning how to use a slingshot and they are just still not quite good at having accuracy. They miss the mark. It's not something to be shameful. It just means you're not as skillful yet. So the same thing happens with sin. In this case, sin, the kinds of sins that come when we are simply being human and haven't practiced yet and need to work some things out in our relationships, that offering is used for the benefit of somebody else. And I think that's how God sees it. He sees sin as something that's going to happen because we're his children and we're inexperienced and we're in this world apart from him. And he's not surprised or angry or shocked when we do commit a sin, when we make a mistake or miss the mark. Instead, he says, I'm going to use it for something good. So the majority of the time, this offering is given when on the Day of Atonement. So the types of animals that are offered, for like the priest, it would be a bullock. For the ruler among the people, it would be a he-goat. For the people in general, it was a she-goat. And for the poor, it was 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Number 5, the trespass offering. This one was offered usually by individuals, and it was a way to make restitution for somebody who had sinned. So in addition to making this offering, you'd have to restore what was taken and also give an additional 20% on top of it. This was intended to fix like breaks of trust, something that had to be like you have to make restitution for. The animal that was sacrificed was often a ram, or it was a lamb if you were a leper, and then a Nazirite would also bring a lamb. So it's either a ram or a lamb. So specifically the sin offering and the trespass offering were intended to deal with guilt. So the sin offering was to say, I made a mistake. The trespass offering was to say, I see how this impacted you and I want to make it right. But an interesting caveat for both of these, this is more for not high-handed sins, but for low-handed sins. If it were something like murder, adultery, abuse, those were not considered to be a part of sin or trespass offerings. These were more like day-to-day things, like in Avatar. When those 2 people groups are fighting against each other because they have this like long-standing feud.
Too bad we can't rewrite history. You thieves stole our sacred orb from Jin Wei.
You tyrants unjustly imprisoned Wei Jin for 20 long years.
It's for that kind of thing, not for actual betrayal. So it's fascinating to consider that there is no sacrifice for intentional, heavy-handed sin. David, for example, mourned because there was no sacrifice for him after he killed Uriah and took Bathsheba to wife. And one might think that that meant that God didn't want to have anything to do with you if you had committed some heavy sin. I mean, what's prescribed in the law if you murder is to be killed. And what's prescribed in the law if you commit adultery is also to be stoned by everyone else because it is such a huge breach of trust. Now, my theory is that the reason why there is no sacrifice for something that severe is because there's only one person that can help with that. And you have to be fully trusting in that person, trusting that he does want to restore you, that he will forgive you, that he'll help you work through it. And I can only imagine the mental and emotional turmoil that accompanies repenting for murdering someone. I mean, we get some kind of a clue when we listen to David mourn, but you just have to come back so far from that in order to be in a trusting and right relationship with other people. Because for them in that society, when trust was broken, it was essentially like the entire environment of the relationship was polluted because of that behavior. And so you have to make it right. With murder, how do you make that right? You can't undo it. Only one person, and that is Jehovah, could help you come back from that. That's why, in my opinion, there was no specific prescribed sacrifice for that, because the people had to recognize that it was out of their hands at that point, and it could only be in Jehovah's hands to restore you back to who you were and to make you innocent again. Whether or not the people really understood that at the time, I'm not sure. Plenty of things get misconstrued when it comes to God's commandments and it comes to church administration or evidently like people administration. Things get lost in translation. And I don't think God's scared about that. I think he can correct anything and make it right at the right time. But I think as far as the original law was intended, it was to help people's faith grow in Jehovah because they had an actual tangible thing that they could do to put them in a right relationship with God. And that tangible thing that they would do with the sacrifice was to shed the blood of something innocent to cover them. And all of it was pointing to Jesus' sacrifice because he was the innocent party who came to cover everyone. And not just to cover either. It's not like to bury or to smooth over. The intention was for people to be confronted with the effects of their actions and see that they were still wanted, that Jehovah still wanted to be in a right relationship with them, and that there were things that they could do to bring that about. Because in a relationship with Jehovah and with God and with Jesus and with the Holy Spirit, like, there's a lot that's out of your control because we're human. We sin a lot. Not even because we're trying to, a lot of it's by accident. And so when you're constantly the party that is making the error and breaking the covenant and polluting the environment of the relationship, of ruining trust, you can't guarantee that the other person is going to forgive you. You can't control that. From what we know of God and from what's written in scriptures, we see that he has a very forgiving nature, that he will forgive. I'm convinced he always will forgive. He has the disposition to do so. And he's not waiting for you to ask for him to already feel forgiveness for you and for him to already have peace towards you. Like, there's no violence in his heart towards you, no matter what you do. But we're the ones that continue to feel discomfort. We're the ones who judge ourselves. We're the ones who allow shame to warp our perception of ourselves. And these sacrifices allowed people to do a ceremony so that they could let it go. And so that they could also celebrate being in a peaceful relationship with God again. That since there's a lot that's out of their control, there's something that could be in their control to make it right. I think it's God acknowledging our dispositions and working with it. And all of it was intended to help the Israelites know that God wanted to have a continuous relationship with them, that he wasn't going to give up on them, and that they could live well, and they could live better than they have before, that their past did not dictate their future. You could go and you could offer a sacrifice to do something about it. And to go and to offer a sacrifice was to publicly acknowledge that you had done something wrong that needed to be covered. That's very cathartic and therapeutic, and it does help rebuild the trust of the community when somebody that you know has done an infraction, if they're willing to publicly say, I'm sorry for that and I want to fix it. There's an absolutely fascinating series of videos that David Pawson has put out, and I love the way that he talks. He sounds kind of like, he looks like Colonel Sanders for one, and for two, he's very deliberate in his British accent. It's very
articulate and methodical and slow so you can embrace what he's saying. It's delightful. I love listening to him. I'll link his video above. And I loved his commentary because he illustrated that when it comes to the types of animal sacrifices, it was to mirror the way that God sees the world. We often define things in terms of what is good and bad. And God sees things in terms of, is it clean or unclean? And is it common or holy? So to break this down, for something to be common versus holy, he gave a wonderful example about how we consider the Bible, the book itself, to be quite holy because it contains words of holiness. And it was made common at one point. I can't remember which country it was, but a whole bunch of Bibles were sent to a country and they were short on toilet paper. So everybody ended up using pages from the Bible as toilet paper. That was taking something that was holy and making it common, which is basic and everyday and not special or unique. Which is what holiness means. Holiness means that it is unique, it is pure, and it is of God. So that's holy versus common. And then the other definition is clean versus unclean. And clean versus unclean meant different than just like being sanitary. If something was unclean or if a person was in a state of uncleanliness, it was because they had come into contact with something that was of this world. Something that showed the temporariness of this life. Something that represented death. So touching a dead body made you unclean. Eating an animal that feasts on dead flesh is an unclean animal, and it makes you unclean if you consume it. For women with their periods or after childbirth, because they have so much blood issuing from them, blood is something that is of this world and considered unclean as it's part of a biological process. So when it's used in the temple, blood is a symbol of purification because it's representing the life or the soul of an innocent creature that's used to cleanse a polluted environment of relationships. It's used to cleanse and restore trust when there was previously distrust. But when it's like part of a biological process, it is considered unclean because it is representative of decay and of the temporary nature of this life. Whereas what is clean is something that represents permanence. There's nothing innately sinful about being unclean, contrary to what a lot of the culture ended up becoming by the time that Jesus came into the world. Being unclean was not sinful, but being unclean and going into the temple or the presence of God in an unclean state, that was dangerous because God is holy and he is so pure that any uncleanness in you gets blown out of proportion. So to be clean, you need to acknowledge that whatever it is that you touched that was decaying or that is representative of death or of this mortal life, that you needed to take care of that first. God is interested in getting us into a holy state and a clean state. That's what he was doing with the Israelite nation. That was the point of the sacrifices. If you see at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, is Deuteronomy before Leviticus? I don't know. Yeah. Okay, so we see at the end of the book of Exodus that there is a tabernacle now built that Moses wants to be able to enter into, because the tabernacle represents the fact that Jehovah wanted to dwell with them, even if it meant living in a tent with them, which I think is so cool. That's so cute. I love that he always wants to be with us. So the problem is that the presence of God was so holy, kind of like on Mount Sinai, it has a natural effect on people who are unclean and people who are not holy enough to handle it. It's just because it's like being in the presence of the sun.
Made eye contact with him, and it was like staring into the sun.
It's just too powerful for you unless you're strong enough to handle it. So the answer that came at the end of Exodus was Leviticus. Leviticus laid out how you become holy, and those sacrifices were how you became holy. It moved you, in preparation to make a sacrifice, you had to move from being unclean to clean. So you had to make ceremonial washings. In order to go from being common to holy, you offered a sacrifice. I think we see this a lot in attitudes with people who say, well, I don't need to believe in God. I can just be a good person. And I totally agree with that. I think you can be a good person and not believe in God. Or even in other religions too that say like what goes around comes around, or wanting to get good karma, or to reach nirvana. Or I think most humans can agree that relationships, being in good relationships, is possible without religion. But God doesn't want just good relationships with everybody. He wants holy relationships, which I admit I'm still trying to figure out how powerful that is and what that looks like. And I know that my relationship with God is such that just by being in his presence and just by talking to him, it makes every other relationship in my life better. Like, he is the only person I can go to receive forgiveness and be okay, and to be able to leave the past behind. Some people may be able to do that without him. I would argue that they can get pretty far without him, but still can't fully let go. And much less be able to offer and extend love and forgiveness to somebody else who's wronged you. I think that requires divine intervention. And not just forgiveness either. To be able to reestablish trust, only God can do that. So this is not about just having good relationships or being a good person. This is about being the kind of person who is unique like God, who is pure of intent like God, who is selfless in their love like God, sacrificial like God, willing to be long-suffering, charitable, willing to forego personal gain if it benefits another person. Like, you can't become utterly selfless without God. You can't know what agape, which is the charitable version of the word. It's the Greek word that's used to describe Jesus' sacrifice. You can't know agape without receiving agape first. Because that's the kind of love that says, I don't need you to reciprocate for me to keep loving you. I don't need anything more in response to you for me to be there for you. I am going to give you my all, no matter what you do in response. I didn't know what that looked like or felt like until God gave that to me. I don't think humans are able to do that without God's help. So that was the purpose of the sacrifices. I don't think it's any coincidence that animals were used for this, because it was an innocent life. Blood was shed because it had to represent Jesus' innocent life and the blood that he shed on our behalf. And like this new life that's given to us because a life was willing to be given. So here is totally my opinion on the subject. I have heard nobody else say this, and you are welcome to dismiss this. It is not doctrine. It's just like the way I see the world. I don't think it's a coincidence that meat is what is consumed as part of sacrificial offerings, especially with that peace offering. It shows that like our bodies are in a better state of peace and calm when we are nourished, and animals are the best thing to nourish you. It's no coincidence that Cain's offering was rejected, which were plants, compared to Abel's sacrifice, which was a lamb. I think this is to point you into a hierarchy of foods for our nourishment. I think at the top of that hierarchy are the ruminant animals. That's why they're used. That's why oxen, bullocks, and cows are at the top of the sacrificial list. And then you have other ruminant animals like goats and lambs that are used. These are animals that are nourishing to our spirit and bodies in the highest and holiest fashion. Because even with the peace offering, poultry's not used. They don't, like, God didn't order a huge amount of turkeys to be consumed and feasted upon exclusively in a 2-day period, probably because it would not nourish you as much as consuming a cow would. And then in that hierarchy, you have vegetables or herbs that are good, but not as good as the animals are. And then you also have fruit, which I have a whole section on how fruit and relationships works together. And then from the fruit, then is when you have grains, which is to be used in times of famine. And often in scriptural stories, it is a famine thing. So you might be saying, but Dara, there was a grain offering offered in the sacrificial system. So like, where do you fit that in this whole hierarchy thing? I will get to a video when it comes to grains, but I think in this instance, it was supposed to show in comparison the work of your hands is grain. Like that's the best that you can produce in this mortal frame, and that God accepts the labor of your hands even when it is a lesser form of provision and resource. It's kind of like when a little kid is so excited because they saw a dandelion and they picked it for you and they brought it in and they're like, look, it's so pretty, I brought this for you. And you know, snap, that's a weed and that's going to take over my entire lawn if I blow on it. And they have no idea that they're giving you a dandelion. They think they're giving you a flower. I feel like that's what the grain offering is kind of like. It's God saying, I will accept your offerings. The works of your hands, we both know are insufficient, but I will accept them. I will accept the hand-drawn pictures from kindergartners. I will accept the first drafts of stories or fantasies written by 11-year-olds or 12-year-olds. I accept what you can offer me, whatever that is. So the grain offering is an acknowledgement that the best we have to offer is bread, and the best that God has to offer is meat. And that's where the two combine. That's why you can accompany a grain offering with a peace offering in that holy barbecue, is to show that God will accept what you have to offer, even when it's not the best that there is. Which gives me a ton of hope. Guys, studying all about the sacrifices makes me feel so loved and feel so accepted and seen, because I know that there's nothing that I can do to save me, and that God's not interested in just saving me. He wants to be in a close relationship with me. He wants me to feel like He is my father and that I am His daughter, that there's really no relationship more intimate than that. He wants the top-notch, most intimate relationship with me and with all of everybody else, all of mankind. This is a God who wants to feed me. This is a God who wants to have dinner with me. This is a God who accepts my sacrifices. This is a God who knows that I need the structure of having my faith be put into a tangible form to see that I am doing something back. I'm doing something in return. I'm at a loss to explain further that this is a father trying to encourage his children to live holier than they were before, to stand apart from this world and to say, success is not measured by wealth. Success is not measured by the amount of kids that you have. Success is not measured by the victories in battle. Success is measured by holiness. And holiness is 100% about relationships. Holiness is about heavenly relationships, ones that are replete with agape. So, as usual, I feel like there's so much more that I could have said, and I could have said clearer, but this is what I've got for now. So if you have any questions, please leave me a comment below if something was unclear. But I just wanted to leave you these thoughts about Leviticus and what it means for us spiritually, and then also what it could mean for us physically. That I think God wants us to be eating meat, and I think that it's on purpose. Oh my gosh, I totally forgot. So on this hierarchy, I put meat at the top. I would also put fats, specifically animal fats, at the very tippy top, because that is what universally everybody understood was like the choicest part of the animal. And I did not understand that until I was a carnivore, because I always eschewed the fat. I favored carbohydrates in place of fat. And it's not until I've made a conscious effort to consume more fats or to like get really fatty cuts of ribeyes that I understand now. I still have a hard time with the texture because it's really squishy, but the flavor and the energy, I feel like I come alive when I consume fat. And I feel so much more healthy and more myself. And it's not like an energy dip. I don't get energy dips because the choicest part of the animal is the fat. And that's why we offer that in the peace offering on the altar. We give God the choicest parts of the animal. And there's still some reserved over. Like, it's not like people were eating just the meat and having no fat. There was still plenty of fat as well. But it was cool to recognize that He wanted that, because the biological effect that it has on us is that we feel more alive when we consume it. So with blood and with fat, you have two different kinds of life being symbolized. Blood is the survival, that's what differentiates you from a creation that was just created from the dust. That's what they saw. Blood makes you alive. And then fat makes you feel like you thrive. That is the difference, because you feel so energized, ready to take on the world, and so at peace too. And it just like helps your brain function correctly. So anyway, that is my spiel for now. But don't worry, I'll have more in the future. So come back next time. I don't know if you consider this enjoyable or if you consider it punishment, but I hope that you find some kind of enjoyment from this and that you learn something about the Bible and maybe something about food at the same time. Take care. See you next time.